The attic in my house was never meant to be explored. It was one of those spaces that seemed forgotten, sealed off, left to gather layers of time and silence. I had lived here for years without ever having a reason to go up there. The only reminder of its existence was the thin wooden hatch above the hallway, its edges rimmed with paint from decades ago, the pull string dangling like a neglected reminder of a place better left untouched. For the longest time, I ignored it, until one late evening, while I was retrieving a box from the hallway closet, my eyes drifted upward. The pull string swayed gently, though the air around me was still. I froze. There had been no draft, no open window, no reason for it to move. My heart pushed harder against my chest as I stood staring at it, that simple thread of string shifting slightly back and forth like a pendulum marking time. I told myself I imagined it. I always tell myself things like that, because it's easier to explain away the strange than to let it sink its hooks into you. But that night I couldn't sleep. Every creak in the rafters, every settling groan of the old house sounded like something deliberate. By morning, I had convinced myself to look, not because I wanted to, but because my imagination had already taken me to worse places than reality possibly could. Dragging the old stepladder from the garage, I positioned it beneath the hatch. Dust rained down when I tugged the pull string, and the door gave way with a hesitant groan, as if it hadn't been opened in years. A dry smell drifted downward, aged wood, paper, insulation, and something else that clung to the back of my throat. Not rot exactly, but something tired. Something that had been sitting in the dark too long. I climbed. My head breached the attic, and I lifted my phone flashlight to cut through the stale gloom. The beam revealed a desert of dust across the attic floor. Thick, untouched layers of it. It coated everything. Cardboard boxes with sagging sides, an old dresser with a cracked mirror, broken picture frames leaning in piles. Cobwebs clung to the rafters and ropes, trembling as if disturbed by my intrusion. But there was one thing that didn't fit. Across the dust, pressed clearly into the gray film, were footsteps. Not paw prints, not scurrying trails from rodents. Footsteps, human, unmistakably so. The outline of shoes, deep enough that the dust had been displaced down to the wood beneath. They started near the center of the attic and trailed off toward the far corner, where the light couldn't reach. I froze in place, balanced halfway between the ladder and the attic floor. My stomach sank as I realized what I was looking at. No one had been up here, not since I'd moved in. I had the only key to the house. I was alone, and yet here they were, footprints belonging to someone else. For a long moment, I couldn't move. My flashlight beam quivered as I tried to steady my breathing. Then cautiously, I hauled myself fully into the attic. The dust shifted under my weight, leaving my own footprints next to the old ones. My throat was dry. I crouched low, scanning the path. The prints weren't recent. They weren't sharp or crisp, but blurred at the edges, softened by a thin layer of new dust that had fallen since they were made. Whoever, or whatever, had left them hadn't been here last night, but they hadn't been gone for long either. I followed them. Each step I took left a soft crunch in the silence, echoing faintly in the hollow attic. The smell grew stronger as I advanced, the stale scent twisting into something sour. My light traced the line of prints as they vanished into the shadows at the far corner. There was nothing there, just a stack of boxes collapsed in on themselves, their contents spilling in indistinct shapes beneath the weight of dust. The footprints ended abruptly at the corner, as though the person who made them had simply stopped walking and stood there. I waited, half expecting to see something rise up from the darkness, but nothing did. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I backed away, retracing my steps, and climbed down from the attic. I shut the hatch firmly and told myself not to think about it, but I did. For days after, I couldn't stop replaying what I saw. Every time I walked the hallway and passed beneath the attic door, I felt as if something above me was listening. The air seemed heavier, as if the dust of that place was seeping down into the rest of the house. At night I dreamed of footprints appearing across the floor, creeping closer to my bed with each passing second. A week later, I decided I had to check again. I don't know what compelled me, curiosity, dread, or a sickening need for proof, but I couldn't leave it alone. I climbed the ladder once more, lifted the hatch, and raised my flashlight into the attic. My heart dropped. The footprints were different. Where before they had ended at the far corner, now they stretched further, looping back across the attic floor in a crooked line. They twisted past the broken dresser, circled near the boxes, and stopped again near the hatch, right near where I had first climbed up. The dust was disturbed in fresh patterns. The edges of the prints were sharper, newer. My own from last week were still visible, dulled slightly with a thin new layer of gray. But these new ones, these hadn't been there before. Someone or something had been up here again. After me. I backed down the ladder quickly, not even closing the hatch, just letting it hang open above me. I locked the hallway door that led to the attic and tried to push the thought away, but the image of those new prints haunted me. I started hearing noises at night. Not the normal creaks of a settling house, but measured, deliberate sounds. Like steps. They came from above, faint but steady. A shuffle here, a soft thud there. Sometimes it was a dragging sound, as if something heavy was being moved across the attic floor. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured someone pacing in the dust above my ceiling. Someone who had left those prints. Someone who hadn't left. I told myself I should call someone, a neighbor, the police, anyone, but what could I say? That I found footprints in dust and heard noises? They'd tell me it was animals. They'd tell me it was the house shifting. They wouldn't believe what I knew deep down. Something was up there. Something waiting. Then came the night. I woke up to a sound unlike any other. A sound that froze every part of me. A soft tap, 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 on the attic hatch above my hallway. It was gentle, almost polite, as if asking to come down. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I stared at the ceiling of my bedroom, waiting, listening. The tapping came again, deliberate and slow. The next morning, I forced myself into the hallway. The hatch was shut, but dust had rained down in a faint sprinkling onto the floor beneath it. And when I looked closer, I saw it wasn't just dust. In the thin film, smeared faintly, was the shape of a footprint, pressed from the inside of the attic. I haven't opened it since. I don't go near the hallway at night anymore. Sometimes I still hear the steps. Sometimes I hear the tapping. And sometimes, when the house is quiet enough, I swear I hear the faint sound of breathing, steady and patient, waiting just above my head. And I know one day, the hatch won't stay closed. I never liked the attic in my house, even before I had a reason to avoid it. Something about that cramped, unfinished space unsettled me in a way the basement never did. The basement was predictable: concrete floor, cold damp air, the faint hum of the furnace and water heater. But the attic was different. It wasn't meant for people, not really. It was a place for things long forgotten. The wooden ladder creaked when I pulled it down, dust sifting into the air like dry ash every time the old hinges strained against their joints. The smell was always the same: aged wood mixed with insulation, a faint sweetness like cardboard gone soft with moisture. The attic had no proper light, just a dangling bulb in the center with a pull string that never quite illuminated the edges. Shadows lived in the corners, lingering over stacked boxes and old furniture draped in yellowed sheets. That night, I only went up there because I needed to. I was looking for a box of winter clothes. The first chill of the season had crept in, and all my heavier jackets were packed away somewhere up in that dark crawl space. When my head rose past the hatch, I hesitated, as I always did. The air was thick, stale in a way that clung to the back of my throat. I switched on the bulb, its weak glow spilling across the plywood flooring that had been laid down decades ago, uneven and warped. I told myself I'd only be there for a minute. The boxes were stacked haphazardly, some marked with fading black marker, others left anonymous with their mysteries sealed away. My footsteps sent soft groans through the boards as I navigated between them, the dry smell of insulation pressing in. The bulb swung slightly from the draft I created, shadows sliding across surfaces like something alive. That was when I heard it. It wasn't loud, not at first. A faint sound, muffled under cardboard and dust. A slow, steady rhythm. Breathing. I froze where I stood, the tiny hairs on my arms lifting in response. I wanted to believe it was my imagination, the way silence in an attic sometimes creates illusions, pipes expanding, wood shifting, the faint buzz of electricity. But this wasn't like that. This wasn't random. It was paced. Inhale. Exhale. Subtle, but unmistakably alive. It came from the far corner, behind a row of boxes stacked high against the sloped wall. The light from the bulb didn't quite reach there, leaving it murky, swallowed by shadow. I held my breath, as though that might help me hear better. The sound was still there, unbroken, steady. Not frantic, not afraid, just present. Something was there. Something was breathing. I wanted to back down the ladder, pretend I had never heard it, that it was nothing. But I couldn't move. My eyes fixed on the shadows in that corner, waiting for them to change, to reveal a figure crouched or lying low. The attic pressed in around me, every sound magnified. The bulb hummed faintly, dust sifted from the beams above, and beneath it all was that breathing. I forced myself to step closer. My feet whispered against the plywood, the boards flexing slightly under my weight. Each step felt wrong, heavy, as though the air itself resisted me. The closer I came, the clearer it grew. It was deeper than I expected, the kind of breath drawn from large lungs. Not shallow, not quick. Calm. Patient. The boxes in that corner looked undisturbed, their surfaces gray with dust. Some had collapsed slightly from years of pressure, but none appeared moved. They smelled of mildew and old paper, that stale sweetness I'd noticed earlier now stronger, cloying. I stopped a few feet away. My hand hovered near the nearest box, fingers trembling. And then it stopped. The breathing ended as suddenly, as if it had been cut off mid-inhale. The silence that followed was unbearable, pressing in on my ears until I could hear the rush of my own blood. I stood there rigid, waiting for it to start again. It didn't. I should have left then. But curiosity is cruel. I slid the box aside, my fingers leaving streaks in the dust. Nothing behind it. Just another box. I shifted more, creating a small gap between the stacks. Darkness pooled there, deeper than the rest of the attic. I leaned closer, squinting into the space. Nothing moved. No eyes glinted back at me, just a void of shadow and insulation. I told myself it had been my imagination, the creak of wood, my own breath echoing strangely in the confined space. I almost believed it, until the bulb above me flickered. For the briefest second, the shadows shifted unnaturally. Something bulked in that gap where the boxes met the wall, a shape that didn't belong, there and gone between blinks of light. The bulb steadied again, humming softly, but I couldn't shake what I thought I'd seen. Something crouched, pressed close against the wall. The air grew heavier then, like the temperature had dropped. My chest tightened as though the space had shrunk, the attic pressing down on me. I backed away slowly, not daring to turn my back on that corner. My foot caught on the edge of a box, the sound echoing sharply in the stillness. And then I heard it again, the breathing, closer this time, not from behind the boxes anymore, from somewhere between me and the hatch. It started with the sound, not loud, not sudden, but soft enough to sink beneath everything else. The hum of the fridge, the faint ticking of the hallway clock, even the hollow silence of the house settling at night. It was the click of metal, deliberate and precise, the sound of a lock sliding free from its place. The attic door. The first time I heard it, I told myself it had been a draft, or maybe the wood shifting. Old houses complain in their own ways. Mine was nearly 100 years old, and the attic door had always felt slightly misplaced. It sat at the top of the stairs like an extra presence, painted over too many times, its frame warped just enough that you had to pull hard to get it closed. I used to avoid going near it at night because it gave the impression of watching. Not in the way a person watches, but more like the heavy awareness of something waiting behind it. When the lock clicked that first night, I lay frozen in bed. The bedroom door was cracked open, and I could see the faint spill of light from the hallway. Nothing moved, no shadow slipped across, no creak of a step followed. Just that sound. The attic door was locked. I knew it had been. I always locked it. It wasn't a habit out of necessity, but more of an instinct. I never stored much up there, just boxes of things left behind by the house's previous owner. Yet every night before bed, I'd glance at it, tug at the latch, make sure it was secure, like something in me wanted it sealed. The next morning I checked. The lock was undone, but the door still sat flush in the frame. I slid the bolt back into place and brushed it off. I didn't want to think about it, but the second night, the same thing happened. The sound came later, closer to 3 in the morning. That sharp, small click carried through the stillness, and once again I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening. It wasn't just my imagination. It was too distinct, too intentional. By the third night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I decided to test it. Before bed, I shut the attic door, slid the bolt, then placed a strip of masking tape across the frame. A simple marker. If the lock shifted, the tape would tear. I remember lying there, my skin prickling with unease as the minutes dragged past midnight. The house was so silent it almost rang in my ears, like I was waiting inside a hollow shell. And then when my body had just started to slip into that fragile edge of sleep, I heard it. Click. I didn't move, didn't breathe, only let my eyes strain toward the faint outline of the hallway outside my door. The silence stretched, heavy and expectant. I could almost feel the air grow denser, like the house itself was holding its breath with me. In the morning, the tape was torn. That was when the attic stopped feeling like part of the house and started feeling like something else entirely. A pocket of space that didn't belong, a chamber pressed too close to where I lived. I avoided it during the day, though the thought of it lingered with me, following me through every room. By the end of the week, the sound came nightly. Always the same. The lock sliding free, then nothing. No steps, no further disturbance. Just the knowledge that the barrier between me and whatever pressed against it had been lifted. The smell came next. Subtle at first, a faint sweetness like we'd left too long in damp air. Then it grew sharper, heavier. A cloying scent that settled at the top of the stairs, seeping from the edges of the attic door. It carried with it something rotten, like paper molding in stagnant water. I could almost taste it when I passed. One evening I stood at the base of the staircase, staring upward. The light bulb above had burned out, leaving the top landing in shadow. The air there felt thicker, heavier than the rest of the house, as though the attic leaked something unseen into the halls. My skin prickled. I thought about leaving the house entirely, checking into a hotel for a few nights, but some quiet dread told me that wouldn't matter. The attic wasn't a place anymore, it was a presence, and presence follows. That night, I pushed a chair against my bedroom door before sleeping. It was a foolish gesture, but I needed it. I needed something between me and the thing that kept unsealing itself above my head. But when the sound came, the chair didn't matter. Click. I swear I felt it. Not just heard it, but felt it reverberate inside my chest like a signal. I could picture the bolt sliding free, slow and careful, not with the speed of someone rushing through, but with the patience of something waiting for the right time. The chair didn't move, but I could hear the air change. The hallway seemed to sigh, boards settling as though weight had pressed against them. Something was shifting up there, behind the attic door. Something that wasn't supposed to. I stopped sleeping properly after that. Each night was a blur of shallow breaths and strained listening, my ears tuned to the inevitable click. Sometimes it came earlier, sometimes later, but it always came. By the 5th night, I started leaving the lights on, but that only made the shadows heavier. Corners swelled with them, stretched long and dark as if the house was bending them toward me. I tried to stay awake one night, to catch it in the act. I sat at the top of the stairs, flashlight in hand, staring at the locked door. The hours dragged on, silence thickening until every small groan of the house felt amplified. I must have drifted, just a flicker of lost time, nothing more. But when my head snapped upright, the lock was undone. I hadn't heard it, hadn't seen it. One moment it was secure. The next, it was not. That broke something in me. It wasn't just happening when I was asleep. It was happening regardless. It was happening because the attic wanted it to. The last night, I remember the air being colder. A strange, damp chill settled into the house, clinging to the walls, seeping through the blankets. When the sound came, it wasn't a single click. It was slower, more deliberate, drawn out, like someone wanted me to hear every fraction of the bolt sliding free. The smell followed, stronger than ever, thick and wet, coating my tongue until I nearly gagged. And beneath it, faint but undeniable, there was something else. A breath. Not mine, not mechanical, but low and steady. Exhaling from behind the attic door, drifting into the hall. I couldn't move. My eyes burned from being open too long. My chest ached from the shallow rise and fall of my lungs. All I could do was listen as the breath grew closer, heavier, like it leaned against the other side of the door. The attic wasn't locked anymore. It never would be again. I never thought much about the attic. It was just there, sitting above my head every night, a forgotten crawl space filled with boxes and dust. Most houses have them. Old wood, insulation, maybe a few spiders clinging to the dark rafters. It wasn't something I felt drawn to, not until I stumbled across something that shouldn't have been there. Something that made me feel like the house had been keeping secrets from me all along. It started when I decided to finally clean the attic. Not because I wanted to, but because every time I went to bed, I kept hearing faint shifting noises above me. A shuffle, a creak of weight pressing against wood, like someone walking carefully, just out of sight. I convinced myself it was the old beams expanding, or maybe rats. But it got under my skin, the kind of sound you can't fully ignore, the kind that lingers until you finally get out of bed to investigate. The narrow pull-down ladder groaned when I dragged it open, shaking off a fine sprinkle of dust that fell across my shoulders. The air that rushed down smelled old, not just dusty, but stale, like something sealed away too long. When I climbed up, the first thing I noticed was the stillness. My flashlight beam cut across boxes stacked unevenly, their sides buckled and swollen from years of neglect. Cobwebs hung like curtains in the corners, trembling at the faintest breath of air. I pushed deeper inside, the plywood beneath me flexing, threatening to snap under my weight. There were the usual things: old Christmas decorations, cracked photo frames, broken chairs that no one wanted to throw away. But near the far corner, behind a stack of moldy books, I noticed something odd. A section of wall that didn't look like the others. The boards there were smoother, less weathered. The dust didn't cling as thickly, as if something had disturbed it not too long ago. I leaned closer, running my hand across the wood. That's when I felt the faintest seam. A line that shouldn't have been there. My fingers traced it, and the more I pressed, the clearer it became. A hidden panel. I don't know why my stomach tightened, but it did. I slid my fingers into the gap, tugged gently, and the board shifted with a dull groan. Behind it, darkness. My flashlight beam sank into the blackness like water swallowed by a well. I pushed the board aside until there was enough space to squeeze through. The smell hit me first. Stagnant, earthy, with a sharp metallic edge that made my nose wrinkle. I crawled in, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The space wasn't just another storage area. It was a room. A hidden room carved into the bones of the attic, concealed behind walls no one was supposed to open again. The floor was layered in dust so thick it muted my footsteps. The beam of my flashlight drifted across objects, and for a long moment I couldn't process what I was seeing. There was a chair sitting in the center of the room. Not an ordinary chair. It was wooden, high-backed, with metal straps fixed to the armrests. A crude restraint. The wood was dark, stained with blotches that looked too much like something that once seeped and dried there. Against the far wall stood shelves, sagging under the weight of jars. Dozens of them. Their glass was yellowed with age, lids rusted tight. Inside, floating in some cloudy liquid, were things I couldn't name. Curled shapes, twisted fragments of what might have been bone or preserved flesh. Some were small, like animal fetuses. Others were larger, indistinct, grotesque. I kept moving, though every part of me wanted to back out, seal the wall, and pretend I hadn't seen any of this. My light passed over drawings pinned haphazardly to the slanted roof. They looked like sketches made in a hurry, charcoal smeared on brittle paper. Faces distorted into grimaces, figures without eyes, long-limbed shadows hunched in impossible postures. The room was quiet, but not silent. There was a hum, so faint I couldn't tell if it came from inside the walls or from within my own head. A vibration in the air, like standing too close to a power line. My chest felt heavy, as if the atmosphere in the hidden room had its own weight, pressing against me. I knelt by a small trunk shoved beneath the shelves. Its surface was cracked, the lock rusted shut, but when I pressed against it, the lid snapped open with a brittle crack. Inside were photographs, black and white, curled at the edges, some nearly faded to nothing. They showed people, families, couples, children, standing stiffly in front of houses or porches. But the eyes were scratched out, every single one, not just crossed with a pen, but gouged, dug away so violently that the paper itself tore. I felt my throat go dry as I flipped through them. None of the faces were familiar, but the houses, some of them looked eerily like mine. Same porch steps, same siding, only older. Like the photographs captured the house decades before I ever lived in it. I dropped them back into the trunk and shut it quickly, but the air seemed to thicken, as if the room didn't want me leaving just yet. I could feel it, something behind the boxes stacked near the far corner. My light caught the edges of another shape. Slowly, carefully, I shifted them aside. What I uncovered was worse than everything else. Another doorway. Smaller, narrower, like a crawlspace opening. Its frame was rimmed with nails hammered in haphazardly, bent and rusted, as though someone tried to seal it shut from the outside. But the boards that once covered it were splintered, forced inward. Something had broken out, not in. The blackness beyond that doorway was total. My flashlight beam didn't touch the end. I leaned closer, and the smell of damp rot rolled over me, mixed with something faintly sweet, like decayed flowers. That was when I heard it. A breath. Long, slow, dragging across the silence like air pulled through wet cloth. Not above me, not around me, inside that crawl space, just past the broken boards. The flashlight shook in my hand. I stepped back, my boots scuffing against the dusty floor, and the sound stopped instantly. The hum in the air grew louder, almost pulsing in time with my heartbeat. I didn't dare move another inch closer. I backed away, pulling the panel shut behind me, sealing the hidden room again. But I couldn't shake the weight of what I had seen. That night, lying in bed, I thought maybe I had exaggerated it all in my mind. Maybe the jars weren't what I thought. Maybe the photos were just some bizarre family quirk. Maybe the breath was the house shifting, just old wood groaning. But then I heard it again. Above me, that long, slow inhale. Only this time, it wasn't muffled by walls. It was closer, crawling along the attic floor, just on the other side of my ceiling. And I know if I go up there again, that hidden door will already be open. It began with a sound that didn't belong. Late at night, when the house should have been silent, I would hear it. The scrape of wood against wood, long and deliberate, like someone dragging a heavy dresser across the floor above me. It didn't come all at once. The first night, it was faint, almost like an accident, just a quick scrape that I thought could have been the house settling. But then it came again, louder, more purposeful, as though something in the attic directly above my room was being shifted. My bedroom had always been the coldest in the house, even during the humid grip of summer. The ceiling was low, the plaster discolored by time and dampness. When I lay in bed at night, I could feel the weight of the attic above pressing down on me, a space I almost never went into. It was only accessible by a hatch in the hallway ceiling, a square cut of wood that had swollen with paint over the years, rarely opened. That place wasn't meant to be lived in. It was too small, too dark, too suffocating. Just beams, dust, insulation, and the forgotten shapes of boxes left behind by whoever had lived here before me. And yet, the noises came from there. It wasn't just the scrape of furniture. Sometimes it was a thump, like something heavy being set down hard on the floor. Sometimes it was lighter, like a chair leg dragging across planks in slow motion. The sound moved, shifting from one end of the attic to the other. I'd lie there with my heart pounding, staring at the ceiling above me, trying to picture what could possibly be causing it. The strangest thing was the timing. It never started until well after midnight, usually when I was on the edge of sleep. I'd jolt awake to that dragging, my chest tightening as I listened. The sound would go on for minutes at a time, then stop abruptly, as though whatever was up there knew I was awake and listening. Then silence would fill the room, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the shallow rhythm of my own breathing. I told myself it was rodents. Maybe raccoons, maybe something larger. But rodents don't move furniture. They don't drag heavy wooden shapes from one corner to another. And the weight of the sounds, God, the weight of them, felt too human, too intentional. The nights blurred together after that, each one carrying the same ritual. The waiting silence, then the scrape, the shuffle, the grinding of wood against wood. It made my skin crawl in a way I couldn't describe. I started dreading bedtime, sitting up in the living room until exhaustion forced me back into my room. Even then, I couldn't escape it. No matter how tightly I buried myself under the blankets, no matter how much I tried to plug my ears, the sound always found me. The house itself seemed to change with it. During the day, everything felt normal enough. Dust motes floating through sunlight, the air stale but calm. But at night, the air grew thick, almost damp. A faint smell would seep down from the attic, like wood rotting in a closed-up space, mixed with something else. A faint metallic tang, like old nails or rust. I began to notice it strongest when the dragging was at its loudest, as though the movement above stirred the air and pushed it down through the cracks in the ceiling. One night, I made the mistake of trying to investigate. The sound had started earlier than usual, maybe around midnight. It was louder than I had ever heard it before, almost violent, like a wardrobe being shoved across the floorboards with both hands. I couldn't take it anymore. My pulse thudded in my ears as I got up, my feet pressing into the cold floor. I grabbed the flashlight I kept by the bed, more for comfort than utility, and walked into the hallway. The air felt different out there, colder, heavier, as though the sound itself had seeped into the walls. The attic hatch loomed above me, just a flat square of painted wood set into the ceiling. The dragging stopped the second I looked at it. Dead silence. I don't know how long I stood there, just staring, waiting. My flashlight beam trembled as I held it, the cone of light catching flecks of dust in the air. I wanted to pull the cord, to climb up and finally see what was happening, but my body refused. Every muscle locked in place, screaming at me to go back to my room. Eventually I did. I backed away from the hatch like it was something alive, watching me, and closed myself inside my bedroom. I didn't sleep that night. From that point on, the sounds grew bolder. They weren't limited to dragging anymore. Sometimes I heard knocking, rhythmic and deliberate, as though something was striking the floor from above with the flat of its hand. Other times it was faster, a skittering rush, like furniture being shoved from one side of the attic to the other in a burst of energy. The worst was the night I realized the dragging wasn't random. I had been lying awake, staring at the faint cracks of moonlight seeping in through the blinds. The sound began again, slow and steady. This time, I tried to map it in my head, following the direction of the noise. That's when it hit me. The dragging wasn't just in the attic. It was moving directly above my bed. I froze, barely breathing, my eyes glued to the ceiling. The sound passed over me slowly, deliberately, like something was sliding across the attic floor and stopping exactly above where I lay. I felt the weight of it pressing down, as though the ceiling might cave in at any second. Then silence. I couldn't take it anymore. The next day, I forced myself to check the attic. Sunlight poured through the hallway window, making the hatch seem almost harmless, like any other part of the house. I fetched the stepladder from the garage, hands slick with sweat despite the warmth of the day. My fingers trembled as I pulled the cord, and the hatch creaked open. The smell hit me first, thick, stale, choking. It was stronger than before, a sour mix of mold and rust that made my stomach turn. I climbed slowly, shining my flashlight into the darkness above. The beam cut through dust and cobwebs, revealing the familiar shapes of old boxes and beams. Nothing looked disturbed. Nothing looked moved. And yet the smell clung to everything, heavy and oppressive. I crawled a few feet in, sweeping the light around, my chest tightening with each second I stayed. Then I saw it. Against the far wall, deep in the shadows, was a long set of scratches carved into the wooden beams. Parallel lines, uneven, like something had been dragged across them again and again. They stretched in arcs across the floor, gouges worn deep into the wood, too precise to be rodents, too heavy to be anything natural. I couldn't bring myself to go closer. The air was too heavy, my instincts screaming for me to leave. I backed out quickly, slamming the hatch shut, and shoved the ladder away. That night, the dragging returned, louder than ever. Only this time, it wasn't just above me. It circled the attic, looping the perimeter of the room as though something was pacing. The weight of it was unbearable, each scrape echoing through the ceiling and into my bones. I buried my head under the blankets, my entire body trembling, praying for silence. But silence never lasted long. And now it has changed again. The dragging isn't always in the attic anymore. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear it closer, much closer. The scrape of wood across wood, but softer now, slower, like something testing the floors of my hallway. Like something dragging furniture where no furniture should be. And sometimes, I swear it stops right outside my bedroom door. The attic in my house was never a place I felt comfortable in. It had that oppressive stillness, the kind of silence that makes you feel like something is listening. Dust hung in the air like powdery fog, disturbed only when a beam of sunlight managed to break through the narrow vent on the far wall. The wooden boards under my feet always groaned and flexed, like the house itself disliked me being up there. I told myself I was only going up to put away a box of winter clothes. That was all. But the moment I pulled the string and the ladder unfolded, a draft of stale, cold air brushed my face. It smelled like old wood soaked with dampness, mixed with something faintly sour, like paper that had been left wet and forgotten. Every instinct in me wanted to leave the box at the foot of the stairs and walk away. But I climbed. The attic was a world of forgotten things. Cardboard boxes sagged under their own weight, and stacks of newspapers leaned precariously like brittle towers. Some of them had fused together, glued by years of humidity. Cobwebs stretched between beams like nets, trembling faintly when I passed too close. I set down the clothes and tried not to look at anything else. But my eyes were drawn to a corner. A box sat apart from the rest, not covered in the same thick layer of dust. The cardboard wasn't sagging, and there were no water stains, no mildew spots. It was almost as if it had been placed there recently. That didn't make sense. I lived alone, and I hadn't put it there. I hesitated before touching it. The flaps weren't sealed, just folded shut. I pulled them back, and the smell hit me immediately, old photographs. It's a hard scent to describe, but once you know it, you recognize it forever. Dry chemicals, faint vinegar, the sharp tang of developing fluid that never quite fades. Inside the box were photographs, hundreds of them, stacks held together by brittle rubber bands, others just tossed loosely inside. They were glossy prints, some curled at the edges, others faded yellow with time. I pulled one out. It was me, not a blurry resemblance, not a trick of memory. It was me. The photo showed me standing in a park, wearing a jacket I recognized but hadn't owned in years. My face was turned slightly away, caught in mid-step, like someone had followed me and snapped the shot without me knowing. I put it aside, heart thudding. I picked another. This one was worse. It showed me in my old apartment, sitting at my kitchen table. The blinds were drawn, the overhead light spilling down. I remembered that apartment well. It had been on the 3rd floor, with no way anyone could have stood outside to take that angle. The photo was taken from inside. I sifted through them, faster now, hands trembling. Each photo was of me. Different years, different places. Some in houses I hadn't lived in for a decade. Some outside stores, walking across streets, entering buildings. Always candid, always unaware. None of them posed. None of them taken by me. The strangest detail came when I pulled out one that couldn't exist at all. It showed me as a child, 6, maybe 7 years old. I was playing in a backyard I didn't recognize. My parents never owned a house with a yard, and yet there I was laughing mid-motion, frozen in glossy paper. I don't have any memory of that place. I shoved the stack back into the box and sat there on the attic floor, breathing too hard, trying to convince myself it was some elaborate prank. But who would go to that effort? Who would have access to photos spanning my entire life? Shots from my childhood, my teenage years, my 20s, and even the house I lived in now. Some of the pictures were from only weeks ago. I dug deeper. My hands brushed against another stack, thicker than the rest. The photographs here were darker, grainier. These weren't taken outside or in apartments. They were taken in this house. One showed me sleeping in my bedroom, the angle low, like whoever took it was crouched near the foot of the bed. Another showed me in the bathroom, brushing my teeth, the camera angled through the gap in the doorway. There was one of me standing at the sink in the kitchen, a glass of water halfway to my lips, my expression blank because I hadn't known anyone was watching. My skin crawled. The walls of the attic seemed to close in, the slanted beams pressing closer. I couldn't breathe properly. I dropped the photos and they spilled across the floor in a wide arc, hundreds of images of me staring back at myself. And then I saw the most recent one. It showed me climbing the attic ladder, a box of clothes in my arms, looking up toward the shadows above. My breath caught in my throat. That was today. That was moments ago. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I froze, listening. The house was silent. No creaks, no shifting beams. Just silence. But it felt heavy, as though something waited, holding its breath alongside mine. I gathered the spilled photographs in shaking hands and stuffed them back into the box. I didn't care how carelessly I handled them. I shoved the flaps shut and pushed the box back into the corner. My body moved quickly, like instinct was dragging me out before my brain caught up. I descended the ladder, pulled it up, and slammed the attic door shut with such force the frame rattled. I locked it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The images burned into my mind. Every creak of the house sounded amplified. Every shadow seemed to stretch across the walls longer than it should. My blinds rustled faintly, though the window was closed tight. I tried to convince myself the photographs were fakes, clever manipulations, but there were too many, too detailed, too perfectly aligned with memories only I should have. The days that followed blurred together. I avoided the attic. I kept my lights on at night, but the unease never left me. The sense that I was being watched grew stronger. In the grocery store, I felt eyes on my back. Walking to my car, I heard the faint click of something like a shutter. At home, the silence felt too exact, as though it was only pretending to be silence while something waited between the seconds. A week later, curiosity, or maybe dread, dragged me back upstairs. I needed to know if the box was still there, if the photographs were real. When I opened the attic hatch, the cold draft met me again. The smell of dust, wood, and photochemicals spilled out like it had been waiting. I climbed slowly, each step heavy. The attic looked the same, boxes sagging, cobwebs trembling faintly. Except for the corner. The box was gone. In its place was a single photograph. It lay flat on the wooden boards, face up. I approached cautiously, my stomach hollow. I bent down and picked it up. It was me, taken from above, as I stood frozen in the attic, reaching toward the floor to pick up the photograph. The same moment I was living in. My hands shook so violently I nearly dropped it. My chest burned with panic, my throat tight and dry. I backed away toward the ladder, never turning my back on the corner, never daring to blink. The air around me felt too thick, too heavy. I lowered myself down, step by step, until my feet hit the floor below. I pulled the ladder up, shoved the hatch closed, and locked it again. I don't know who took those photographs. I don't know how they appeared in the attic, or why they vanished. I only know the silence of my house feels like a held breath. And when I turn off the lights at night, I sometimes see faint glimmers, flashes, as though someone somewhere in the dark is still taking pictures. And maybe one day, I'll find the next photograph, waiting for me, exactly where I shouldn't. It always started the same way. The sound would come at night, when the house had finally settled into silence. It wasn't creaking wood or the faint groan of pipes straining against the cold. It wasn't the kind of noise you could brush off as the natural settling of an old structure. No, it was sharper than that. Rhythmic. A persistent sound of something dragging, raking, clawing just above my head. Scratching. The first time I heard it, I froze in bed. My room was directly below the attic. The sound filtered down through the ceiling, muffled but distinct, like nails dragging against rough wood. At first, I thought it was some small animal, a squirrel maybe, or a raccoon that had found its way in. But there was something too deliberate about it, too steady. It wasn't frantic the way a trapped animal would be. It was patient, repetitive, like it was trying to carve its way through something. Every night after that, the scratching came back. The rhythm would change slightly, sometimes faster, sometimes slower, but always with that same awful steadiness. And then, like clockwork, the moment I mustered the courage to pull down the attic ladder and climb up, silence. It was as if the attic swallowed the noise whole the instant I entered. The air up there always felt different, thicker somehow. Stale, like dust and insulation had been festering in a closed-off box for decades. My flashlight beam would sweep over the boxes stacked high, the broken furniture leaning in shadow, the thick layers of dust coating everything like forgotten snow. Nothing moved. No animal, no object disturbed. Just me standing there, heart hammering, listening to a silence so heavy it pressed against my ears. And when I'd give up, close the attic door, and return to bed, within minutes, the scratching would start again. It began to eat away at me. I tried explaining it to myself rationally. Maybe the act of opening the attic startled whatever creature was up there, forcing it into hiding. Maybe it was a rat, or several of them, freezing still at the sound of footsteps. But the more I listened, the less animal it sounded. There was something intelligent in the pauses, in the shifts of rhythm, as if the scratching adjusted itself in response to me. Sometimes it would stop suddenly, long before I ever reached the ladder, almost as if it could hear me moving in bed. I became hyper-aware of every sound in the house. The ticking of the clock, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the wind outside brushing against the siding. But the scratching, it was always distinct. I started to dread the nights, dreading that first moment when the noise would begin. My body would tense before it even happened, waiting. I began to notice other things, too. When I pushed open the attic door, a faint smell would seep down. Not strong, but noticeable. Damp, like old wood left out in the rain. And beneath that, something metallic. It wasn't the clean metallic tang of tools or nails. It was sharper, sourer, almost like iron left to rust. Once, when I climbed up and swept my flashlight across the insulation, I thought I saw faint lines carved into the wooden beams. Thin, shallow scratches that hadn't been there before. They didn't look random. They looked patterned, almost as if something had been trying to draw or carve symbols into the structure itself. The dust disturbed me the most. The attic floor was layered with it, untouched for years, or at least it should have been. But each time I went up, I noticed faint trails across the floor, like something had been dragged across it. The first time I saw them, I told myself they were just my own footprints from the night before. But they weren't. They veered off, curving toward corners I never went near, behind boxes I hadn't touched. One night, I thought I heard it breathing. I had climbed into the attic again after the scratching stopped, crouched low with my flashlight sweeping slowly across the darkness. My breath was loud in my ears, and for a moment, I was sure there was another set of breaths overlapping mine, ragged, shallow, just beyond the beam of light. But when I held my own breath and listened, the sound was gone. I didn't sleep much after that. Days blurred together in a haze of exhaustion. The nights were endless. The scratching always returned, and always ended the moment I stepped into that heavy silence above. It was as if the attic wasn't just hiding something, it was protecting it, shielding it. The more I thought about it, the more it felt like the attic wasn't simply a part of the house. It was separate somehow, a place that existed on its own terms, obeying its own rules. I started leaving the attic door cracked open at night, just to see what would happen. The scratching still came, but it felt more hesitant, more cautious, like whatever was making it knew I was waiting. Sometimes the noise would start and stop in bursts, as though testing me, checking to see if I'd rise from bed. And then one night, something changed. The scratching was louder than usual, harsher, almost desperate. I lay there staring at the ceiling, my chest tight, as the sound clawed and dragged with a frantic energy I hadn't heard before. It went on until I couldn't take it anymore. I climbed the ladder, pushed open the attic door, and raised the flashlight. The silence was instant, but the air was different this time. It was colder, the kind of cold that sank through your skin and into your bones. My light cut through the dark, and for the first time, I saw movement. Not much, just the faint sway of something behind a stack of boxes. I froze. The beam trembled in my hand, sweeping slowly, until it landed on the far corner of the attic. The dust there was disturbed, no more than disturbed. It was cleared, as though something had been lying there, shifting night after night. And just above that patch of cleared floor, etched into the wooden beam, were dozens of fresh scratches. Long, jagged lines, layered over each other until they almost formed shapes. Shapes I didn't want to recognize. I felt a weight settle in the room with me. Heavy. Watching. I turned off the flashlight. I don't know why. Maybe some instinct told me I didn't want to see what would happen if I left it on. The darkness swallowed me, and in that void I heard it. Not scratching, not breathing, but a sound like nails gently tapping on the floor, inches away from where I stood. I never used to pay much attention to the attic. It was one of those spaces that simply existed above me, a dark, dusty void hovering just past the ceiling, forgotten except for the occasional seasonal box or holiday decoration that needed to be retrieved. For years, it had been a place I rarely thought about, but looking back, that forgetfulness was exactly what allowed someone, to take advantage of it. It started with little things I told myself were nothing. Groceries that didn't last as long as I thought they should. Lights that were left on when I was certain I had turned them off. The faint sense of something disturbed in the stillness of my home, as though the air carried the faint echo of someone else's movements. I dismissed it. I told myself I was tired, overworked, losing track of small details. The mind can excuse a lot when it's desperate to feel safe. But the unease grew. At night, when the house settled into silence, I would hear faint disturbances above me. Not the kind of creaks old houses make, but soft, deliberate thuds. Sometimes it was a shuffle. Other times, it was so faint that I questioned whether I had heard it at all. I told myself it was mice, or maybe a raccoon that had found its way in. But there was something human about the timing. The sounds came when I lay in bed, when I was still, when the house itself should have been utterly quiet. I remember the first time I smelled it, a faint sourness in the air, drifting downward from the hallway ceiling. It wasn't strong, but it carried a human quality: sweat, stale clothes, unwashed skin. I walked through the hall several times, sniffing, trying to place it. I thought maybe it was plumbing, maybe the pipes were leaking, maybe mold. I sprayed air freshener, lit a candle, opened a window. But it always came back, faint but steady, lingering just beneath the surface of everything. The attic door was in the hallway ceiling, a simple wooden hatch with a dangling string. I avoided it. I didn't want to climb up there, didn't want to face the dust, the cobwebs, the clutter. But the longer I ignored it, the more that space seemed to press down on me, as though the weight of what lingered above was settling directly onto my chest. At night, I began to hear breathing. Slow, heavy, and deep, drifting through the stillness of the house like the steady rhythm of a sleeper. It was always faint, always so subtle that I questioned if it was my own imagination. But it had weight, direction. It came from above me. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, and hold my breath just to make sure I wasn't confusing it with the sound of my own lungs. Even then, it would continue, a second rhythm overlapping my silence. And every time I dared to acknowledge it, it would stop, as though whatever was above me knew I was listening. The nights became unbearable. I found myself turning on every light in the house before going to bed, as if brightness could force away the weight pressing down from the attic. But the sounds never stopped. I began to dread the evenings, dreading the way the world outside would fall silent, leaving me alone with whatever lived above me. Then the signs became physical. My food was disappearing. Not much at once, just enough to pass unnoticed if I wasn't paying close attention. A loaf of bread with fewer slices than I remembered. A half-empty jug of milk. Things in my fridge that weren't placed quite where I had left them. One morning, I walked into the kitchen and found a cupboard door left open. I never leave them open. I stood there staring at it for a long time, my stomach twisting in ways I couldn't explain. I told myself I must have been careless, but deep down I knew. Someone had been in there. I finally forced myself to investigate the attic. The ladder groaned as I pulled it down. Dust sifted into the air like a warning, catching the light and floating in thick, lazy clouds. I climbed slowly, each step heavy with dread. The smell hit me first. Stronger now. Sweat, old food, the unmistakable tang of human presence in a place that should have been empty. My flashlight beam cut through the dark. The attic was as I remembered. Stacks of cardboard boxes, insulation exposed along the beams, cobwebs clinging to the corners. But tucked between the boxes, in a small hollow space I had never noticed before, was something that shouldn't have been there. A blanket, crumpled and stained. Empty food wrappers scattered across the floor. An old water bottle, half full. And next to it, something far worse, an old notebook. The pages were filled with writing. Not neat, not orderly, but scrawled in frantic lines, covering every inch of the paper. I couldn't make sense of it at first. Snippets of words, sentences cut off halfway, strange sketches of faces, houses, and eyes. Always eyes. Wide, staring eyes drawn in heavy strokes. But the worst part was the dates. They were recent. Some entries were only days old. My hand shook as I turned the pages, the air thick with the reality of it. Someone had been here, living above me, watching me. I thought of the breathing. I thought of the missing food. I thought of the times I had felt eyes on me in my own home. And then I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice. The notebook wasn't just filled with random scribbles. It contained observations. About me, my schedule, when I left for work, when I returned, what I ate, when I slept, even what I wore on certain days, all written down in uneven, obsessive detail. I dropped the book and stumbled backward, my flashlight beam swinging wildly across the attic. Every shadow looked alive. Every corner seemed to shift. I fled down the ladder, slamming the hatch shut as if that thin piece of wood could possibly protect me. But the horror didn't end there. Over the next few nights, the sounds grew bolder, louder. I heard deliberate footsteps pacing above me. I heard dragging noises, as though something heavy was being moved across the attic floor. And worst of all, I began to find things in my own bedroom that I hadn't placed there. A glass of water on the nightstand. A blanket folded at the foot of the bed. Tiny details, subtle intrusions, but all carrying the same chilling message. Whoever had been living in the attic was no longer content to stay hidden. Sleep became impossible. I moved from room to room, too afraid to stay still for long. Every creak in the floor, every whisper of air through the walls sent my heart racing. I would sit in the corner with the lights on, clutching a kitchen knife, listening to the faint sounds of movement above. It all came to a breaking point one night when I woke to the sound of the attic hatch creaking open. I didn't move. I couldn't. My breath caught in my throat, my entire body locked in cold, paralyzing fear. The sound was unmistakable, the gentle groan of wood, the shuffle of weight on the ladder. Someone was coming down. I stared at the darkened hallway outside my bedroom, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run, to flee, to do anything but wait. And then I saw it. A shadow stretched across the floor. Long, thin, unmistakably human. I never stayed to see the face. I bolted from the room, out the front door, into the night air. My bare feet slapped against the pavement as I ran, not daring to look back. I didn't stop until I reached the neighbor's house and pounded on their door with everything I had. The police found evidence. They told me later there had been a man living up there for weeks, maybe months. He had made himself comfortable, building a nest of stolen food, blankets, and notebooks. He had watched me, studied me, written down everything about me. They never caught him. By the time they searched, the attic was empty. The only thing left behind was his notebook. And even now, I sometimes wonder if he's really gone, or if he found a new attic, a new ceiling to hide behind, a new life to crawl inside. Sometimes at night, when the world falls quiet and I'm alone in bed, I still hear it. That faint, deliberate breathing, just above me. It started with a smell, not strong at first, but faint, like the sour hint of spoiled milk, or damp wood left too long under rain. I noticed it one night while lying in bed, staring up at the faint lines of the ceiling above me. My house was old, its bones creaking in the quiet hours, but that smell wasn't something I had ever experienced before. It wasn't the kind of scent that drifted in from outside, carried by the night air through cracks in the windows. No, it was deeper, heavier, something that seemed to bleed down through the very plaster above me. At first, I ignored it. Old houses carried odors, mildew, dust, the faint musk of wood long since dried and hollowed out. But the smell didn't fade. Each night, as I lay beneath the ceiling, it grew thicker, pressing against me like invisible weight. It curled into my nostrils, burned faintly in the back of my throat, and clung to the sheets around me. I started keeping the windows open, even in the cooler nights, hoping the breeze would cut through it. But the smell wasn't so easily banished. It had roots. It lived there, embedded in the ceiling just above my bed. After about a week, it was undeniable. The smell wasn't just unpleasant, it was rancid. It carried the unmistakable note of rot. Sweet in the worst way possible, cloying and rich. The kind of smell that doesn't just reach you but seeps into you, lingering in your clothes, on your skin, in your hair. The kind of smell that makes you feel unclean just for breathing. I began to notice how localized it was. If I walked through the hallway or into the kitchen, the air was fine, dusty, maybe with a trace of detergent or old wood polish. But step back into my room, close the door, and it hit me. Always above me. Always from the same patch of ceiling. It was as though something had crawled into the space above and died. The attic. That thought came slowly, hesitantly, but once it arrived, it refused to leave. Something was up there. A squirrel, maybe, or a raccoon. Houses like mine weren't exactly sealed tight. Animals found their way in easily. The idea of a carcass up there filled me with dread, but also with inevitability. I would have to check. The first time I tried, I didn't make it far. The attic hatch was in the hallway, a square panel of wood with a dangling cord. Pulling it down felt heavier than it should have. The ladder unfolded with a long groan, each hinge protesting years of neglect. Dust rained down in faint spirals, illuminated in the weak light of the ceiling fixture. I stood at the base, staring up into the black square above, my skin prickling at the thought of what waited for me in that darkness. The smell was faint there, too faint for certainty, but in my bedroom it was unbearable. I told myself I would get gloves, a flashlight, maybe a mask, anything to delay the act of climbing up into that stale, untouched air. Days passed. The smell grew worse. Sleep became almost impossible. I would wake in the night gagging, pressing the pillow over my face to shield myself from it. My sheets seemed saturated with the odor, no matter how many times I washed them. It was like the ceiling itself was dripping it into me, night after night. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I gathered what I thought I'd need: thick gloves, a flashlight, an old t-shirt tied around my mouth and nose. I pulled down the ladder and began to climb. The air shifted the moment my head breached the square. Thick, stagnant, unmoving. The attic was a heavy place, its air damp and soured, and I could taste the rot on my tongue even through the cloth. My flashlight's beam cut a pale arc through the dark, catching on insulation torn in places, wooden beams lined with dust, and boxes sagging with age. The smell was worse up there, but still I couldn't place it. Not yet. I crouched fully inside, the floor creaking beneath me as though it resented the weight. Dust clung to my skin, to my hair, to the t-shirt I wore across my face. I swept the light slowly, trying to follow the source. At first, I thought I saw nothing. Just storage. Just the forgotten skeleton of a house left to itself. But then I noticed the discoloration. In the far corner, where the attic sloped low, the insulation was darkened, stained with something that had seeped through. It glistened faintly, wet in the light. My stomach turned instantly. The closer I crawled, the thicker the smell became, choking me, forcing bile into my throat. I thought I would find an animal. Bones, fur, the collapsed ruin of something that had gotten trapped and died alone. I told myself that over and over as I crawled, my gloved hands sinking into dust and grit. The flashlight beam trembled in my grip, and each second stretched longer than the last. But when I reached the corner, what I found was an animal. The insulation had been pulled back, as though something had been hidden there intentionally. And beneath it was a cavity, a space carved out between the beams. I shone the light inside, and what reflected back was not the glassy black of animal eyes, nor the twisted form of a carcass. It was something else entirely. Plastic. Thick black plastic like garbage bags, taped and layered, but torn open by time or decay. And from that split, something pale protruded. Flesh. I froze, my body refusing to breathe, refusing to move. The smell was unbearable there, waves of it rolling out of the cavity, saturating the air so heavily I thought I might suffocate. My mind scrambled to explain, to rationalize, but there was no reason, no excuse for what I was looking at. It wasn't just one bag. There were several, stacked awkwardly, squeezed into the hidden space. Some had collapsed under their own weight, pressing against the beams. The tape was brittle, flaking, and the pale shapes inside. A hand, not whole but unmistakable. Fingers curled slightly, the nails still faintly visible, though yellowed and warped by rot. I jerked backward, my head hitting the beam above with a hollow crack. Pain shot through me, but I barely registered it. My body scrambled on instinct, shoving me away from that corner, away from what I had seen. The flashlight slipped, rolling across the dust, its beam swinging wildly, illuminating more glimpses of the horror stuffed into that cavity. Bag split open, pale, wet shapes, bones jutting through torn plastic. A faint glimmer of hair matted into clumps. The attic groaned under me as though the house itself was aware of the violation, as though the beams resented the exposure of what they had been hiding. I don't remember getting down the ladder. I don't remember how long I stood in the hallway afterward, gasping through the makeshift mask, my gloves trembling with dust and filth. I only remember the smell, how it clung to me, how it followed me. Even now, no matter how many times I've showered, no matter how much I've scrubbed my skin raw, I swear I can still smell it. That sweet, sick rot seeping into me, sinking into the walls of my house, into the fabric of my life. And worst of all, I don't know who put them there. I had lived in that house for years before the attic became something more than just a forgotten space above my head. For the longest time, it was nothing more than a storage void, a place filled with dust, broken furniture, boxes of clothes that had long since lost their owners, and memories that weren't mine. The only thing I ever noticed about it was the light fixture, a single dangling bulb that had been dead since the day I moved in. It never turned on, no matter how many times I tugged the chain. At first, I had told myself I'd fix it, maybe replace the bulb or the wiring. But months turned into years, and the attic remained in permanent shadow. I barely went up there anyway, so I stopped caring. The darkness became part of the attic's character, heavy, stale, and undisturbed. That's why when the light came on one night, I froze. It happened slowly. I was in bed, half asleep, when a thin glow leaked from the narrow seams of the attic hatch in the hallway ceiling. It wasn't moonlight. It wasn't the dim orange spill of the street lamps outside. It was white, sharp, unnatural, and it filled the gaps like liquid bleeding through a wound. I stared at the ceiling for what felt like an eternity, waiting for my eyes to betray me. The light in the attic had been broken since forever. There was no way it should be glowing, and yet it was. The house at night is never silent. Wood creaks, air shifts, old beams settle, but that night every sound seemed to vanish as if swallowed by the glow above. My breathing was loud, too loud, and I could hear the wet click of my throat each time I swallowed. I wanted to convince myself it was nothing, a trick of faulty wiring maybe. But that explanation carried no weight, because the light had been dead for years. Eventually, I forced myself out of bed. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and with every step toward the hallway, the light grew brighter, humming faintly as though electricity had a voice. By the time I stood under the hatch, the glow was so intense that it pooled onto the floor, casting long shadows that swayed and stretched across the walls. The chain dangled there, perfectly still. The same chain I had pulled countless times to no result. Now it seemed alive, dripping with light like it had been dipped in molten glass. I didn't open the hatch that night. I couldn't. Something in me whispered not yet. Instead, I stood there for minutes that stretched into an hour, staring, listening, waiting. Nothing moved. Nothing changed. And then, without warning, the light flickered once, dimmed, and went out. Darkness reclaimed the attic. I told myself to forget it, sleep it off. Old wiring, I repeated over and over in my head. Just bad wiring. But the smell came next. The following evening, as the sun went down, I caught it, a faint, sour odor seeping through the seams of the hatch. It was the smell of rot, the kind that clings to damp wood or spoiled meat. It coiled down the hallway, threading its way into my nostrils, coating the back of my throat. I opened windows, I sprayed air freshener, but nothing could cover it. And worse, the light came back. This time, I didn't hesitate as long. I grabbed the old step ladder from the closet, positioned it beneath the hatch, and climbed. My hands trembled as I reached for the chain, and when I pulled, the door creaked open with a moan that echoed through the house. The light was blinding. For a moment, I couldn't see anything beyond the glow, only the dust swirling in it like snow. Slowly, my eyes adjusted, and I saw the attic as I remembered it: boxes, old furniture, forgotten junk. But it felt different now. The air was warm, thick, and alive with a faint vibration, as if the light itself was breathing. Shadows warped unnaturally, bending around the boxes like they were hiding something. I climbed up. The wood groaned beneath my feet, fragile, complaining. Every object seemed more sinister than I remembered. The cracked mirror in the corner reflected a distorted sliver of me. The armless mannequin looked almost like it was turning in my direction, and then the smell hit me at full force. It was coming from the far side of the attic, near the wall where insulation spilled out like open wounds in the wood. The closer I got, the worse it became. My stomach twisted, while rising in my throat. I held my sleeve to my nose, but it barely helped. Something had rotted here. Something had been left behind. I reached the wall and noticed something odd. The floorboards were stained. Dark, irregular blotches that spread like veins from a single point. The bulb above me buzzed louder, flickering, as if urging me not to touch it. But I did. I knelt down and pressed my fingers to the stain. It was sticky, old but still moist in places. My skin recoiled instantly. I pulled back, wiping the residue onto my jeans, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. And then I heard it. Not the creak of wood or the hum of electricity. This was different. It was a sound like movement. Shuffling. Slow, deliberate. Coming from deeper within the insulation. Something was inside the walls. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. The sound grew clearer, something dragging like claws scraping wood. Then came the breathing. It wasn't mine. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off that section of wall. The bulb above me began to flicker more violently, casting the attic in strobing flashes of light and shadow. For split seconds at a time, I thought I saw something pressing against the insulation from inside, bulging, shifting, as though the wall itself was stretching to contain it. The air grew hotter, oppressive, until sweat poured down my back. I could no longer tell if the bulb was flickering or if my vision was collapsing under the weight of fear. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the light went out. Darkness swallowed everything. I stumbled backward, fumbling for the hatch. My hands scraped against splintered wood, desperate, frantic. The breathing was still there, louder now, closer. I could hear the rasp of each inhale, wet and ragged, as though whatever was in there was suffocating on its own existence. Finally, my fingers found the edge of the hatch. I pulled myself down, nearly falling off the ladder in my haste. The moment I slammed the hatch shut, silence returned. The smell lingered, thick and foul, but the breathing, it stopped. I didn't sleep that night, or the nights after. The attic light has turned on every evening since, glowing through the cracks of the hatch like an unblinking eye. I refuse to open it again, but I know it's waiting for me. The smell grows stronger each day, seeping into the walls, into my clothes, into my very skin. And at night, when I lie awake, I hear it again. The breathing. Not muffled anymore. Not hidden behind insulation. It's just above me, directly over my bed, in the attic's floorboards. Slow. Wet. Patient. Waiting.